Welcome to the Social Mission Revolution.
Each week we explore some of the greatest undertold stories of businesses and everyday people who are making their ultimate impact on the world through social mission. This is Social Mission Revolution.
And this is your host, Andrea Putting. Welcome to another episode of the Social Mission Revolution. Today I'm here with Nick Savaidis from Etiko, and I'm quite pleased that I've been able to get Nick to come on board because his brand has been one that my family has worn for some time. So I'm really happy to be able to talk to him about the social mission behind the brand. So Nick, I'd love you to just tell us a little bit about who you are and about Etiko.
Hi, Andrea, and hi, listeners. Happy to discuss or share some of our story with you all. Etiko pioneered the whole idea of eco-friendly, ethically made fashion and footwear in Australia back in 2006 now. So we've created a street fashion brand for the conscious consumer, for people who are not only passionate about the impact on the environment, but also the potential impact of what they buy as consumers on the people who work in supply chains. So everyone's heard about the use of child labour, sweatshop labour and slave labour. And we know it's a problem. And anyone who watched Four Corners on Monday night would realise that despite all the promises or the claims by some of the big fashion brands, that serious exploitation in the fashion industry is still going on. So we've created a brand for people who want to buy products which they know are genuinely ethically made and as eco-friendly as possible.
And a very good quality as well.
Yeah, well, we tried to make the garments as high quality as possible because we're trying to make things as sustainable as possible, and one way for the products to be sustainable is to make them in a way that they're going to last for quite a while, and that people are going to want to wear for a long time.
Yeah,
we're not a fast fashion brand. That's not our audience.
Yeah, and I love wearing your t-shirts because they have a really nice feel to them and that nice quality that you want, makes you want to wear them, which is.
Well, we've sold over 250, probably closer to 270,000 t-shirts since we started, and the feedback we get almost 100% is that people can actually notice the difference in the quality. They're not cheap, but they're not super expensive either. But they're certainly high quality, and same applies to our hoodies and even our underwear. Our footwear has got better over the times, but footwear is a lot more technical, and it was hard to get them right the first time. But the more we produce them, the better quality the sneakers get as well.
Yeah, and they're comfy. And so, Nick, I have a question I ask everybody I have on the podcast. So, if there was one thing for you to fight for, what would that be?
Yeah, well, I thought about this question because you gave me a bit of forewarning that it was going to pop up. And the reality is, there's a lot of things I want to fight for. But if I was to pin it to one, it was to, fight for, the welfare of children. I get really upset when I see kind of children suffering. I feel upset if I see anyone suffering, but in particular children. I don't know whether it's because I'm a parent. I'm a parent myself. I'm also a grandfather now, and I can't believe some of the suffering I see amongst children, not only in Australia but worldwide. And it could be because of hunger, it could be because of war, it could be because of violence at home. It's I find it really upsetting, and if it was something that gets my goat up and really makes me angry, it's watching children suffer.
Yeah, and I guess that would have a bit of an impact on what you do too, because a lot of those sweatshops use child labour, don't they?
Well, I remember when I was at university being quite keen on a brand called Nike, and
Mhm.
when I was at university, Nike was the cool brand to kind of wear. And I stopped thinking they were cool when I saw a photo of a young girl stitching a Nike soccer ball. Yeah, yeah. So, but
Yeah.
child labor and the fashion industry, child labor and the sports industry have gone in, and child labor and a lot of products have gone hand in hand for years. Um, and it's still actually happening even in this day and age. It's amazing that there's so much child labor, sweatshop, and slave labor in this day and age. But we live in a society that's has benefited or that relies on the exploitation of other people.
Mm.
And often those people that are exploited are children. Yeah.
Yeah, a vulnerable target.
Yeah, I mean, I've sometimes kind of ask people why are children used to make sports balls or clothing, and well, actually, the cotton seed is one that people don't realise that a lot of the cotton seed that is used to grow cotton, which is used in the clothing that we wear, there's that's where the majority of child labour in the fashion industry is now occurring, because it's much easier to hide it in remote villages in India or other parts of the world. And often they use children, especially young girls, because they're the right height to collect cotton seed.
Yeah.
They don't complain. Um, yeah, it's quite easy to physically intimidate them, and you don't have to pay them very much or pay them anything at all.
Yeah. It's
And
a really unfair world for these people, isn't it?
it's incredibly unfair. Man, we live in a society where we're incredibly. I know there are people struggling in Australia and other parts of the world, in the other parts of the Western world. But if you're born in Australia, as far as I'm concerned, you've won the tassada of life. We've got so many more advantages than other people do, other nations have, and we take it for granted. And I travel quite. I've travelled quite a bit through developing countries. I mean, I work with producers in Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka, and I go into remote, as well as I go into the cities, but also go into the remote parts of those countries. And there are a lot of industries that are aligned on the exploitation of young and old people.
Yeah. What started you off with this on this venture, Nick? It's really interesting to hear the stories behind why people get so involved and then start a whole business that is around that social mission.
Okay, well, I run a street fashion brand, but it's not because I've got a passion for street fashion. Actually, I find fashion boring. I can't believe that people spend their time worrying about it so much. I mean, that's not to say I don't appreciate people who've got a personal style or dress in a unique way and in an attractive way. But this obsession with the fashion industry, it's not something that's interesting to me. I'm interested in creating social impact and also minimising environmental impact of what we do. I've been aware of the exploitation of workers and people in the fashion industry from a long time, because growing up in the Melbourne suburb of Thornbury, my mother used to work for a number of fashion brands in between raising 4 children. When we were quite young, she stayed at home. She was a stay-at-home mum. And in our lounge room next to our black and white television, we had a Singer sewing machine. It was a really old machine. I honestly don't know how old it was, but it was an antique looking machine. And my dad had actually put a little electric motor attached to it, and he basically had converted to an electric sewing machine. But next to that sewing machine, there was a big pile of fabric, and my mum would spend time during the day sewing garments for big and small fashion brands, and being paid 15 to 30 cents per garment. And but at the time there was nothing unusual about that, because I used to walk into homes of other families in the street and would see other mothers doing the same thing. It's actually quite a common experience for migrant women during the 60s and 70s. That's when we actually had a fashion industry in Australia.
Yeah, that's right.
There's so little fashion being produced these days. Actually, it's still occurring. I mean, they're still finding cases of migrant women being exploited in the suburbs of Springvale or some of the outer suburbs of Melbourne. And I've seen photos of women working in their garages and being paid piece rates and not being paid workers' compo or superannuation and not being paid the award wage. And so it still does occur, but it was quite on a much larger scale during the 60s. And one of the brands that my mother worked for was a brand called the House of Maryvale and Mr. John.
Yep.
I'm not sure whether you remember that brand. I think you're young, substantially younger than myself.
Not really. No.
But it was they were in Collins Street. You'd go downstairs into a really kind of cool looking retail outlet. And they were the cool retailer in Melbourne at the time. And I went in there with an older cousin of mine when I was about 11 years old, and we saw some clothing that my mum had sewn being sold for around $50, and
which was a lot of money back then.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
But as an 11-year-old, I couldn't work out why my mum was paid so little for that. When I told her, she couldn't believe it. When we told her that, but I didn't understand the vagaries of the capitalist system, and I just thought it was really unfair, because when I was growing up, our family really struggled financially, and raising 4 kids, would have been financially challenging for anyone.
My family was just about the same around the same time, so I understand what you're talking about.
But what do you do about it as an 11-year-old? Apart from thinking it's a bit unfair. And then when I was when I went to high school, when I started high school, I'm not sure whether you recall, but so were you raised in Melbourne or?
Yeah, in the western suburbs, with a lot of migrant families surrounding me.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it happened in your school, but we used to have community aid abroad. Used to come out to schools and do presentations. They became Oxfam.
Yeah.
And they would often talk to us about injustices around the world, and kind of I realised that the suffering of workers wasn't restricted just to Australia, that it was international kind of experience, and that farmers around the world were being exploited as well.
Yeah.
Then kind of later on, when I started going to university, I started reading New Internationalist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure whether you're familiar with that magazine.
Yes, I am.
I've been subscribed to that publication for the past 40 years, and it's been a big influence on my life, and kind of really opened my eyes to the extent of suffering and exploitation around the world. And it kind of led me to, when I was at university, going into retail shops and asking them if they could guarantee me that the clothing or footwear or whatever they were selling was free of child or sweatshop labour or slave labour. And I used to get a very negative reaction to those questions, especially from the managers.
Absolutely.
So that was 40 or so years ago. Yeah. And amazingly, if you did that right now, you'd get a very similar reaction. So, I'd invite listeners to go into their favourite retail outlets and ask them if they can prove to you that the products that the retailers are selling are free from exploitation of workers, whether young or old. But that's what I did.
Even know.
No, and they don't want to know. In most cases, it's pretty challenging. I mean, there's not too many products which are cheaper now than they were 30 or 40 years ago, but clothing and footwear is actually cheaper now. I'm not sure whether you you recall price of clothing when we were growing up.
As a 10, 11-year-old saving up to buy my first pair of Levi jeans.
Levi? You were lucky to buy
Well, I had to save up for them because my family, that was out of the question. And I think it was $7.
Yeah.
And so I look at the price of things now and just go, this is obscene to think that we're still paying some of those prices that I paid as a teenager, and they're still the same price 40 years later.
Yep.
Nuts.
Well, the only way that can happen is if someone else is actually paying the price.
Yeah.
That's the challenge. Is no one's paying the true cost of the things that we buy, not just in terms of the exploitation of workers, but also the exploitation of other people in the rest of the supply chain, and as well as the impact on the environment. I mean, no one's actually built in the cost of what do you do with a pair of jeans when you finish with it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to take a long time to break down. At least with most jeans, they're actually made from cotton, but there's a lot of jeans which are made from polyester cotton blends, and they're never going to break down. They're going to take hundreds of years. Yeah. And no one. How do you measure the cost of that, and how do you measure the cost of the dyes that are being tossed into the rivers during the process of dyeing the fabric? Those dyes are often just pumped into the local waterways and are polluting the local rivers and killing fish and poisoning populations.
Yeah. There's so much to it.
A few months ago, I met a owner of a fashion brand from Switzerland, and he was telling me about some geographical area in Switzerland which was a lake, and there was a lot of fashion companies working, and when they were producing things in Switzerland, and he was telling me that the lake was incredibly polluted because of that industry. And you couldn't eat any of the fish, you couldn't swim in it. It was that toxic. But he was saying that over the years that lake cleaned up. Now, it didn't clean up because of because the companies started changing the way they operated. Well, it actually didn't, to agree, because what they did is they simply sent all their factories to developing countries.
Yeah.
And so they got rid of the problem by simply
moving the
passing it on to someone else. Yeah, moving the problem. Yeah,
somewhere else. Yeah.
And then you could actually at least in Switzerland, the government, I think the government probably wouldn't tolerate that kind of behaviour now. But there's a lot of leeway given to industry in developing countries, way too much leeway. And, the environment and those populations are suffering from. But anyway, so the reason why I brought it out, because once again, people aren't paying the true cost of what we're purchasing. So, and we're talking about how I got this. So, when I was at university, I was aware of this actually happening, and I used to upset a few retailers by asking them questions. But I also managed to upset my parents because one of my responses to finding it hard to buy ethically made clothing and footwear was to actually start wearing second-hand clothing.
Yep.
And if you know anything about migrant families, that's the last thing they want to see their children doing. I mean, they didn't come all the way to Australia to see their children wearing second-hand clothing like the way they used to when they were suffering when they were growing up. Yeah. Anyway, I managed to upset my parents at the time, but luckily at around the same time, the punk scene was pretty big in the mid-70s, late 70s. And so when I used to wear ripped jeans, people thought it was because it was a fashion trend. Well, it was looking cool, I have to admit. But
now
people thought I was just being... And I can't believe that people buy jeans and pay money for ripped jeans. It just blows my mind. And I just hate... I should actually, next time I go to a jeans factory, I should actually ask the workers what do they think about the fact that they're being paid minuscule amounts to actually put a rip in a jean.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Anyway, so after university, but that's all I could do as a university student, just complain or stir things up and just resort to wearing secondhand kind of clothing. Later on, when I graduated, I kind of became a high school teacher. So I qualified as a high school teacher. And I used to look at the impact of globalization with a lot of my classes. Do you remember our beloved treasurer, Costello? Peter Costello? Yeah. He was whinging at one stage about teachers spreading left-wing propaganda. I'm not sure whether you Well, I was one of those teachers who was kind of opening the kids up to the realities of the capitalist system, and we'd look at issues such as child labour, sweatshop, and slave, and the students would get really upset quite naturally, especially when I show them photos or videos. But then when it came to their free dress days, they turned up in the very brands that were doing it, that were doing those things. But I thought, you can't blame the kids, because what choices do they have? I mean, it's their parents who normally buy their clothing for them, and they're not going to be able to change the system, just like I wasn't able to change it when I was in high school. But then, I sit in the staff room and talk about similar issues with my colleagues, and teachers have this self-perception, or they're perceived by a lot of people in the wider community as being a bit centre-left or left-wing, and we talk about the evils of multinationals and how the system needs to change. But when it came to buying school uniforms or sports gear, and we'd still go buy the cheapest, and there's a disconnection between what we said and what we actually did.
Yeah.
And I thought, but nothing's going to change unless kind of consumers changed, and left it at that. I was lucky in that in the late 80s, early 90s, I was given the opportunity to work on remote Indigenous communities in Australia as an adult educator. And so I went from teaching at high schools to working in adult education in the Northern Territory on remote Indigenous communities. And when I moved to the Northern Territory, I was told before I should start doing anything, I should actually sit down and speak to the communities that I was working with to find out what they wanted me to do as far as providing some kind of education. And a lot of the feedback was, what's the point of doing literacy and numeracy if there's no jobs on the communities?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, you got a point there. And I spoke to my immediate supervisors about that kind of feedback. And they said, well, do you want to have a go at trying to create some employment on communities? So I spent 5 years developing a whole series of being involved. Some of the enterprise. So I spent a number of years helping develop a range of small businesses, micro businesses, everything from a community laundromat to a slaughterhouse to a screen printing business. And the biggest project I was involved in was a video conferencing network. So all those businesses were actually owned by the communities.
Yep. And
I would bring in specialists to help train people to actually run those businesses, those organisations. At the time, I've never heard of the expression social enterprise.
Yeah.
But reflecting on it now, that's what we were doing.
Yeah.
We were creating jobs that were more than just turning over money. They were creating some kind of positive impact on the community. So they're actually creating employment in areas where there was no employment, creating pride for the communities. It was generating incomes in remote areas which were were very hard to generate income. They were delivering services or addressing health issues. So with the community laundromat, which I think cost us about around $10,000 to get off the ground. And I mean, the only people who had washing machine on one of the communities I was living in were the white folk, the people who were employed by the health department or the education department or the police force. But the community members themselves, the Indigenous communities members, didn't have access to washing machines. So, we managed to set up a laundromat with commercial grade washing machines.
Mm-hmm.
With the slaughterhouse, this probably upset a lot of the vegan fans of Etiko, but the community had its own cattle station, but they were sending all their cattle to Adelaide to be slaughtered, and they would buy the meat back from the same slaughterhouse.
Oh, that sounds absurd.
Well, that's the reality. So we set up a slaughterhouse on the community, and which was run by the community, and engaged a butcher to come and train people to do it themselves. And it was a great experience actually. Though the one organisation, one business I spent most of my time with was a a business called Urumpi Crafts, which was involved printing traditional designs onto T-shirts and fabric.
Yeah.
So in the late 80s and 90s, it was actually almost impossible to go into a souvenir shop in Alice Springs, Sydney or Melbourne and actually buy a T-shirt with an Indigenous design on it, which was printed by an Indigenous person, and more than likely it wasn't even designed by an Indigenous person.
Yeah, I've seen
so
that.
We thought, why couldn't we do that ourselves? Because the community I was working on, Yuendamu, actually a lot of the communities I was working on were pretty renowned for their artwork, for their dot paintings, but not all the community members could earn decent money through dot painting. There was only a small number who were kind of considered good enough to earn good money, but there was a lot of artists who, they had good designs, but we tried to help generate some income from them. So we start off with this. We got one of the local primary school teachers to teach 3 members of the community how to print on T-shirts, and we started generating some income doing that. When all the money was invested back into the enterprise, and we bought some screen printing equipment, which helped us scale up. Then when we started generating some income, we approached the Department of Employment and Education, said, look, we want to create this employment project on this community, but we need X number of dollars. And I think it was around $100,000 to set up a proper facility. And we were successful in raising that money. And then we started getting some big orders. I think, Oxfam was our single biggest retailer, and they were selling it through their catalogue.
Yeah.
And, the community was kind of stoked to see, their T-shirts, their designs on white fellas, being sold around Australia. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did that for 5 years, and it was a great experience. But eventually we had to kind of leave Central Australia and came back to Melbourne, and I tried to find employment with organisations like Oxfam and World Vision, but I was unsuccessful. And I thought, why not set up my own business for good? Once again, I had never heard of the expression social enterprise, but I thought it'd be interesting to create a business which made a profit by doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. And so I started off by distributing a brand called No Sweat, which was an American brand. It was started by a group of activists in North America. And it was the first ethical fashion brand in the world. Well, it was the first one which was intentionally set up to address exploitation in the fashion industry. And it was primarily sneakers. It was actually started off by a group of activists, including a guy called Jeff Ballinger. And Jeff is kind of renowned in the anti-sweatshop movement because as the godfather of the anti-sweatshop movement, he's the guy who wrote about Nike in the late 80s. Yes, he's the one who went into the factories in Indonesia and exposed what was happening in the Nike factory. He took the photos and stories which upset everyone, but he was telling the truth. Yeah. But Jeff and a few other labour rights activists basically were saying, look, but nothing's going to change unless consumers change, and consumers aren't going to change if you can't give them something as an alternative. People are still going to buy clothing and footwear, so we need to create an ethical alternative. And that's how the No Sweat brand was started in 2002, 2003. And I picked up the distribution rights for Australia, and I distributed the No Sweat brand in Australia for about 4 years. And then I eventually developed my own brand. So we launched Etiko in 2006.
Yeah.
Primarily, initially we actually started selling Etiko's fair trade sports balls, soccer balls, netballs, etc., which are all certified fair trade. The Etiko sports balls were actually the first non-food products to be certified fair trade. Everyone's heard about fair trade coffee and fair trade chocolate.
Yeah, thought of that.
And so this is part of the same accreditation. And so at one stage I was selling Etiko sports gear and No Sweat sneakers and clothing. And eventually I decided to expand my own Etiko brand to include clothing and footwear.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing this since 2006. So we were the first non-food company in Australia to be certified fair trade. And it's hard getting fair trade accreditation, and it's even harder to keep it. So
yeah, you've got to stay on track with that.
you have to be audited on a regular basis, and you have to prove
Fair enough.
every year that you are doing the right thing, and that you can verify any claims that you make.
Yeah.
So did I answer your question why I started it?
Yes, you did. But since you started Etiko, you've gone, I guess it was not an easy slog to start with. But
no, on reflection, I think we were probably about 8 years ahead of our time.
Yeah.
Okay, so 8 years ahead. Yeah, I'm trying to count backwards. But up until about 2013, we really kind of struggled to make the business viable. Firstly, I don't think that, we had to develop the supply chains to be able to prove, to, be confident when we're telling people that everything we do is ethically made and eco-friendly. So that took a while to actually do that. And to get the accreditations that we needed, that it wasn't an easy task, especially when you're the first.
Yeah.
But then also, I don't think the market was ready. When we used to talk to people prior to 2013 about whether it's child labour, sweatshop or slave labour, people thought they could recall vaguely in the around 2000 early 2000s that big brands were caught doing the wrong thing, but everyone assumed that the industry had been fixed up, that those issues had been addressed. So I don't think a lot of people believed what we were saying. And certainly a lot of people didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, I find that's what it's. I think that's across the board on a lot of issues. Is people don't hear that's
what changed in 2013 was the unfortunate tragedy at Rana Plaza. That's the factory in Bangladesh that kind of collapsed, and around 1,200 workers were killed, and about 2,500 workers were seriously injured. It was pretty hard to ignore that. So that was not the first industrial accident in the fashion industry, and it wasn't the last one either. It was just the biggest one. It was actually hard to ignore.
Yeah.
I mean, for years, there's been small disasters where 10, 20, 100 or so people have been killed or seriously injured, but they were quite easy to ignore, and the media in Australia largely did ignore it. But you can't ignore 1,200 workers being killed or 2,500 workers being injured. And so the Rana Plaza tragedy was the turning point for us. I feel bad that my business has kind of benefited from that tragedy, but that's the reality. As a result of that tragedy, the Australian Ethical Fashion Report got off the ground in Australia, and fashion brands in Australia were asked to share information about their supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, since 2013, we're the only fashion brand in Australia to achieve an A+ every single year that report has come out.
Yeah.
For the first 3 years, we were the only fashion brand to get an A+. But since then, there's a few other brands, including Outland Denim and Mighty Good Undies, who are also achieving good results. And the Australian Ethical Fashion Report Guide is a good tool, but the reality is that it's only the brands who get an A+ are worthy of anyone's support. And it's only the brands who get an A+ who can prove that they pay workers living wages.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of talk about ethical fashion. And there's a lot of brands claiming that they're ethical. Even some of the bigger fast fashion brands are claiming they're being ethical, that they're claiming that they are ethical. Mind you, if you watch the Four Corners program on Monday night, you would have seen a couple of those very brands who claimed that that they were ethical, implicated in use of slave labour in China.
Yeah, well, that's not really what we want as ethical, is it?
So it's, if people want to use the Australian Ethical Fashion Guide as a report, please only seriously consider the A+ brands, and there's only about half a dozen of them to with them. But
and you've got a few
yeah,
awards along the way as well, haven't you?
so it's important to get that recognition in the Australian Ethical Fashion Report. But we've won quite a few awards for environmental sustainability. So back in 2008, we won the Banksia Environmental Foundation Award for most sustainable business in Australia. It's not just the most sustainable small business, but most sustainable business, full stop.
Yeah.
And it's great to get that kind of acknowledgement, because we were up against quite a few big players.
Yeah.
And the one that means the most to me is winning the 2016, the Australian Human Rights Award in 2016 in the business category. Because it's important, because when I started the business, because I wanted to create social impact, and to be able to be recognised, to get that recognition by the Australian Human Rights Commission meant a lot. It's pretty important.
It means you've done what you set out to do.
Yeah. But, still, even though we've been operating now for 13 years, it just feels like we're starting out. And that's because I think the market is finally turning, and there are more and more conscious consumers. Probably is not as many as people think they're out there, because a lot more people talk about sustainability and social justice than actually apply to their purchasing decisions. You look at every school in Australia talks to kids about social justice and sustainability, and then they go buy sweatshop-made school uniforms.
Yeah.
That's disconnection. So, we really need those people who talk about sustainability, social justice, to actually start leading by example.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's really where we all need to look at everything that we buy and everything that we consume and throw out, and how can we do that in a better way.
Yeah, so it's nice to win awards, but the bottom line is we need to keep growing, because we can't create impact unless we're actually selling product.
Yep.
And we can't sell product unless we're creating social impact. So the typical Etiko customer is a conscious and conscientious consumer who's buying into our values. We think the business can be operating in a better way. We think the world can be a better place, a fairer place. But we can't bring that change unless people buy products from us. We're not a charity. We don't get donations. We don't have free labour. I mean, everyone who works for us gets paid, apart from the occasional intern who gets credit for their course. But basically, all my staff are paid staff.
Yeah.
And we make sure that everyone who works in our supply chains gets paid, and more important, gets paid a living wage. Yeah,
that's really important. They need to be able to survive, otherwise you're not being ethical with what you do.
But it's still very early days for us. And what's really interesting is to see the interest in our brand, not just around Australia, but internationally. So about 30% of traffic to our website now comes from the rest of the world.
That's great. Yeah.
And often reach out to these people and ask them why would they kind of contact a small brand based in the suburbs of Melbourne. And the response is that it's actually really hard to buy genuinely ethically made products even in Switzerland, even in the United States, even in Canada.
Yeah. So what advice would you have if somebody was, they wanted to start a business, they want to do it ethically? What advice would you provide for them?
Sorry about that cough. I often get approached by people wanting advice, and even yesterday we had a young lady come and see me about setting up a scarf business. She wanted to make scarves, but she wanted to make them ethically and as eco-friendly as possible. First up, it's incredibly challenging. It's incredibly difficult. Actually, anyone who's actually ever run a business will realise how hard it is. It's all encompassing. You've got to put everything on the line. You've got to wear so many different hats. You've got to have so many different skill sets. I really admire small business operators because I know just how difficult it is, and I don't think a lot of people realise. The average person doesn't realise how challenging it is. One thing that all social enterprises, one thing that all social enterprises that I'm aware of have in common is that they all started under-resourced.
Yes.
And it was only one mistake I made. I was lucky. I was able to combine teaching while I was developing the business, but I also had a very supportive spouse. My wife Liz was quite supportive, and she was working in the corporate sector while I was developing the business. So unless you've got that kind of support, all those kind of resources, you're going to really struggle. Secondly, you got to decide how much of a genuine social enterprise you expect to be, because it's quite, you can have a business which has social impact, but not necessarily can be considered an enterprise. I've come across a lot of social enterprises who wouldn't be able to survive unless they got donations or a lot of volunteers or a lot of outside support. I don't consider them enterprises. It's actually called a charity.
Yes. There's a few lines there to draw between things.
I'm trying to avoid mentioning names, but I have spoken to an organisation that specialises in supporting social enterprise sector, and their feedback is that probably about 70-80% of the social enterprises they're operating couldn't survive without outside support.
Yeah.
As someone who's put everything on the line and has been generating everything that we've ever done, we've always had to pay for and generate our own income. I don't consider them social enterprises. I call them charity. I consider them charities. Yeah. So you got to work out whether you're able to create income and enough income to generate growth in the business or to generate the impact. Don't rely. If you're going to be a social enterprise, it means that you can't rely on grants. The occasional grant is okay, but long term you've got to be able to stand on your own. The business has got to stand up on its own 2 feet.
That's about being sustainable.
And actually not just sustainable, but also generative. I actually remember when I first started, someone asked me what kind of business I wanted to develop, and I said I want to create a sustainable business, one that's going to be able to sustain itself, keep itself going. And he said, no, what you want to do is you want to create a generative business, one that generates profit and in turn generates social impact, because the more profit you make, the more impact you create.
Yeah.
So that's what I've been trying to do over the past, since he told me that. I've been trying to develop a business which kind of keeps on kind of growing, creating more impact.
Yep.
We've reached a stage now where the business is self-sufficient. We've been growing by 10 to 20% every year for the past 5 years. And, we've been making a profit for the past 4 years. But I know we could grow it a lot more. So we've reached a stage now where we're looking for investors who can see the potential for the brand, not just in Australia, but internationally. We're not bringing on investors because we need them to keep the business growing, but in order to go from being a niche activist kind of brand, which I think a lot of people see us as, but to take the brand into the mainstream, we need a lot more resources. I could probably get there eventually in 10, 20 years' time. But we want to do it now. Yeah, we want to do it in the next couple of years. So I need to bring on people with certain skill sets that I don't have.
Yeah.
We need to build up our inventory, because one of the challenges we have is to always have enough stock on hand, because one of the challenges being a fair trade business is you have to pay your suppliers at least 50% when you place the order, and you've got to pay for the order before it ships, which restricts on how much stock you can carry.
Yeah.
Generally, the way in the other world, in the non-ethical world,
they don't pay until they sell it.
We've had major retailers tell us they'll happily stock our products, but they won't pay their invoices for 120 days.
Yeah, you can't survive like that.
We can't survive that, and our suppliers couldn't survive like that. So because of those challenges, we can only carry so much stock. So we're looking for investors who can see the potential for the brand and realise that one of the challenges we've got is build up our stock levels, not just for the Australian market, but also for the international market. And thirdly, there's no point winning all these awards and leading the way in this ethical space if people don't know about our brand.
Yeah.
So what we want to do is spend more money on marketing and getting the message out. So we are looking for investors now and we will be in the near future. So if you know anyone, if anyone in the audience is interested in an award-winning ethical enterprise with potential not just in Australia but internationally, please reach out to us. We are looking at presenting to impact investors, individuals and organisations, but we're also looking at the crowdfunding for equity model. So I think that there's it's quite exciting to see what's happening with crowdfunding these days, because I'm not sure whether you're aware or whether the audience is aware that a few months ago the laws changed in Australia, which now enable small business like ours to sell shares in our business to small investors, and that could be anywhere between $100 up to $10,000. And so when we get approached for advice on creating an ethical fashion brand, I tell people, well, one option you've got is, certainly you go out and take the risk and do all the hard work, or the alternative is to actually work with some of the existing fashion-based social enterprises. Because they all have that challenge where they're all under-resourced.
Pull together to make things work. Yeah. So it's been great talking to you, Nick, and hearing your stories and how you've gone about developing the brand. And so I'd like to encourage people to have a look at the website and to reach out and have a look at the Etiko brand, because...
So it's Etiko is etiko.com.au. And we've got a shop based in Baronia for those living in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. You can come and actually have a visit. But I encourage people to go into your local clothing shops or shoe shops and ask them why they're not selling ethically made, eco-friendly clothing. You think of any of the shopping centres. You mentioned you're based in Wonga Park, so I challenge anyone to go into Eastland Shopping Centre and actually find one ethically made product.
Yeah.
And because I know we're based at Knox City and near Knox City Shopping Centre, and there's not one shop in Knox City that sells one ethically made product.
Yeah.
And it'll be the same around Australia and even internationally.
Yeah.
So certainly encourage your retailers. We've actually had a lot of retailers tell us they're not convinced that consumers care enough. Yeah, so they need to hear it from consumers. We've also had retailers telling us they feel uncomfortable with what we're doing because they feel it raises too many questions about other brands in their stores. How do you promote what we do without putting that seed in the brain of the consumer? So if this is ethical, what's everything else in this shop?
Yeah.
But if the retailer knows they're going to miss out on the opportunity to sell you something because they don't have it, it will inspire them to look at for an ethical alternative.
Yep.
And also, if there's any listeners who've got children at school, ask the school what's the school doing to make sure they're avoiding buying products which potentially contain child sweatshop or slave labour.
Yeah.
For people who work in the corporate sector, a lot of corporates have uniforms or merchandising, with messages on it, and more often than not, that all those garments are made in sweatshops because these organisations want to buy the cheapest possible T-shirt or polo shirt or hoodie to put their message on, and they need to think about what's the impact of doing that.
Yeah.
So there are ethical alternatives, and Etiko can certainly help give you alternatives, but there are a few brands now who can also do that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's be aware and have a look and ask questions.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share our story with you and your audience, and wish you all the best with your podcast. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. Now, this has been another episode of the Social Mission Revolution, and we'll be back next week with another Social Mission Revolutionist. This has been the Social Mission Revolution with Andrea Putting. Join me again next week when we'll speak to another social mission revolutionist who will inspire you on your journey to making your ultimate impact on the world.